The universe is the story of matter organizing itself, moving from a dissociated state to an associated state. The most advanced and complex manifestation of this, as far as we know, is the human brain. We are the most organized, the most efficient system. And therein lies the problem. Water plays a crucial, fantastic role, and the ocean is our birthplace.
The Arctic is a misunderstood place. Most people around the world tend to think the Arctic is inhospitable, cold, foreboding. And for us who live there, it's home, it's beautiful, it's majestic, and it's warm in its hospitality. So it's a very giving, almost a maternal energy for me, because that's where I was born, and the Arctic is just spectacular. It was a community shock in the 80s when we realized we were being poisoned from afar. And in the sense that persistent organic pollutants, which are the byproduct of industry and pesticides, had made their way up into the Arctic through the weather patterns and ending up in the marine mammals that we ingest. What has come to this world that would make for Inuit women having to think twice about nursing their babies as a result of toxins ending up in their nursing milk, because of African women who were trying to save their babies from malaria by using DDT, pesticides. What a world we'd created when the women of the world had to carry the brunt of globalization. And so it became a real process, a learning for me, that humanizing these issues of environmental degradation of the Arctic, including climate change, are key to getting people to understand these issues, not just from a political perspective, economic perspective, a scientific perspective, but from that human connectedness that we have to each other, no matter who we are in the world. And so that was the success of that treaty, which led to the signing of the Stockholm Convention. And we were quite successful because we engaged in the politics of influence rather than the politics of protest, to get the world to understand this as an urgent health matter.
We all know the threats against life and biodiversity. There are 5 main factors. The first obvious one is destruction. It's very clear. We destroy, we make it artificial. The second factor is contamination, pollution. Soon there will be more plastic in the ocean than plankton. But plastic can't generate oxygen, so that will be a massive problem for us. The third factor is what we call over-exploitation. This happens when we catch more than what life produces. Today we're nearing the limit, and if we surpass that, we'll be over-exploiting. That's how we are constantly killing the golden goose. The fourth factor is the spread of invasive species. We humans spread everything everywhere, and this is dramatic in the oceans. A cargo ship will fill up with seawater in Rotterdam before heading out to get crude oil and petroleum in Oman. Then it will spit out this Dutch water over the Arabian Peninsula desert and contaminate everything, because a single drop of seawater can contain 1 billion living organisms. The fifth and last factor is climate, which is changing too quickly. We must remind people that climate has always changed, but right now it's changing way too fast, and that's never happened like this before. That explains today's rise in sea levels and the melting of the continental ice sheet and polar ice caps. So those are the 5 things that threaten life on Earth. And once we admit that we are part of this life, a lot of things will change, because we'll realize that when we attack, destroy, or pollute it, we're actually attacking ourselves. themselves. It's a bit stupid for a species that calls itself wise man, Homo sapiens.
I had a marvelous time reading your book. I feel like I'm someone who just discovered a new world. It's always remarkable, the inventiveness of nature.
Plankton is a catch-all word. It comes from the Greek word planktos, which means drifter. So these are organisms that drift in the currents. It could be viruses, bacteria, and other tiny organisms like jellyfish, which also drift in currents. Before, the Earth had no oxygen. So the living creatures that need oxygen, including us, were born out of the oxygen created by these microorganisms, which continue this work today. It's not just forests that produce oxygen. Plankton creates at least half of our oxygen. Obviously, these organisms are the first link in the food chain. Then we have creatures that are a little bigger, like krill, which are little shrimps, up to massive creatures, like whales.
When you see whales, it's so extraordinary. You go, oh! And in doing that, we synchronize our breathing with them and feel a connection with the ocean. It's compelling. It goes straight to your heart.
The St. Lawrence
estuary is a huge pantry for the Atlantic Northwest. All of these whales come here to feed because it has the most resources. We call whales the engineers of the ecosystem because they perform a number of roles that benefit the smooth running of the ocean. They can stir the water and make the nutrients available all through the water tunnel, and not only on the surface, where there's a lot of sunlight for photosynthesis. Without whales, everything necessary for the ecosystem's smooth running would stay on the surface. But because whales have to go up to breathe, they come back down to the depths. This stirring is very beneficial. Also, whales defecate on the surface. And like in all good farming practices, anything that photosynthesizes plants works better when you add fertilizer. The same thing happens in the ocean. The whale's defecated matter acts like fertilizer for maximum photosynthesis carried out by the phytoplankton. When they die, whales sink to the sea floor. Once settled, the body becomes its own ecosystem, teeming with all sorts of species for over 50 years. About 30,000 different species use the body to live. Throughout its lifetime, about 50 or 60 years, depending on the species, a whale can capture 33 tons of carbon, the same amount as 1,500 trees.
I've always been fascinated by sharks. Since I was a child, at the aquarium where I'd spend my vacations with my parents, the sharks were what I loved the most. They're not dangerous. They're a lot more scared of us than we should be of them. Usually, sharks try to avoid us, so seeing a shark up close is a true miracle. Ecosystems with sharks are very healthy because the entire food chain is present. And as sharks feed on the weak and sick, they prevent epidemics. Malpelo is my great love. Malpelo is my baby. It's where I work most of the time. It's a very remote island that's 500 kilometers off the Colombian coast from Buenaventura. It's the most immersed part of a unique volcanic chain under the sea. The highest part is 300 meters above sea level. Cliffs are sometimes vertical. Their walls go down vertically to a depth of 4,000 meters. There are submarine mounts that become really important spots for several highly migratory species, such as hammerhead sharks. Malpelo is one of the few places in the world where you can still see schools of hammerheads, silky sharks, Galapagos sharks, whale sharks, tunas and turtles. The biodiversity is just incredible, not only through the sheer number of species, but also the number of individuals and their sizes. This also shows that the ecosystem is healthy. Malpelo became a marine protected area in 1995, and it's thanks in part to our efforts as divers. We could see, for example, industrial boats fishing all the sharks, etc. That's when we started to fight to get the government to designate Malpelo as a flora and fauna sanctuary on a par with other national parks in Colombia. Today, the marine protected area has increased to 27,000 square kilometers. And at this moment, we're working on increasing the area again, thanks to the scientific studies we carry out on site.
I've always been fascinated by the biology of corals. We often think of a coral as a simple organism because it has no brain. So we assume that its behavior will be simple and not very diversified. Coral is a very peculiar animal because it has a symbiotic relationship with a microalgae called Zooxanthella. This algae photosynthesizes, meaning it needs light to create energy. After that, it transfers 90% of its energy to the coral. Corals are animals that don't necessarily need to eat. We know that coral reefs provide crucial services for the ecosystem. The first is coastal protection, which they help to limit. In Moria, we've estimated that coral reefs account for about 70% of wave energy mitigation. They also contribute to tourism, thus generating extra revenue. It's less known, but thanks to their high biodiversity, a coral reef is a bit like an underwater pharmacy, as it contains many molecules that may be used to heal us. I find coral biology fascinating, especially its sexual reproduction. It's not like us. It doesn't have just one form of reproduction. Some coral species are hermaphrodites. They have eggs and sperm in the same polyp. And when they lay their eggs, they release little balls, inside of which are 10 to 15 eggs containing, in their center, a clump of spermatozoids that break out into the water column. And then, these oocytes and spermatozoids will find other congeners to fertilize with. Some corals change sex after a certain age. They were once male, then become female. Among other species, some colonies are only male. They eject only sperm into the water, while another only female colony ejects eggs. In other species, known as larvae incubators, the sperm will fertilize the egg inside the polyp where it will develop. Then, at some point, the polyp releases its larva, which is already independent and able to swim. It's like giving birth to a fully developed baby coral. And this little larva swims until it finds a suitable place to metamorphosize.
For me, ethology speaks to authenticity. I like to watch animals doing their own thing in their own environment. Ethology is quite a new field of biology. It's not that it's new that humans watch animals, but as a formal science where we try to understand animals in their authentic setting, that's a fairly new science, and it's really grown a lot in the last few decades. We really need to see fishes through a new lens. For too long, we've been thinking them either as a source of food or a source of recreation. But if you look at their lives, they have very interesting lives where they think, they have feelings, they have social lives, they recognize each other. They do so many things that most people don't realize they do. We're actually living in an age of fishes. The diversity of fishes has expanded greatly in recent millennia. And there are now over 33,000 kinds of fish in the world that we know, and probably several thousand more that we haven't even discovered yet. We tend to be mammal-centric because we're mammals, but the age of mammals is actually long past. Mammals peaked and now they've declined in diversity on Earth. It's only in the last half-century or so with the advent of scuba diving and cinematography underwater that we can go and witness them in their own realms. And boy, the discoveries. We don't generally think of fishes as being artists, but there's a nice example involving a little pufferfish off the coast of Japan, the males of which spend hours and days building and maintaining these beautiful mandalas. They're circular structures. They're really exquisite. They do it to try and impress a female of the same species. So the female comes along. If she's impressed enough, they mate. They lay their eggs in the middle of the circle. They bring little stones and pebbles and bits of shell, and they sprinkle that over the eggs to protect them and to hide them. So it's an example of sexual selection where over the course of tens of thousands of years, females were very choosy, and they tended to favor males who did better artwork than other males. That's what drives the evolution of such an extravagant behavior. Fishes don't just have willy-nilly interactions with other fishes. They know other individuals. It's been shown they recognize them over long periods. Other studies show fishes have personalities. And one of the most complex and well-studied symbioses of any animal is the cleaner-client mutualism that happens on reefs, where you have small fishes and they work in teams of 2 or 3 or even more, and they have their station. And other fish, so-called client fish of many, many species, will line up to wait their turn, a little bit like going to the hairdresser. They go in and out of the gills where parasites can attach. And so, of course, the client gets a parasite removal service and a spa treatment, and the cleaner gets food. So it's a mutual benefit. Some fishes can live for an incredibly long time. It was quite recently discovered by analyzing the layers on the cornea of Greenland sharks. These are sharks who swim under the ice. By counting the eye corneal layers, it's like counting the rings on a tree. Had close to almost 400 of these layers. So this shark was born when Shakespeare was still writing his plays. And these fishes have to live to about 135, 140 years before they're sexually mature, before they're old enough to even reproduce. So you have to wonder what life is like for an animal who lives that long, how much wisdom they may accumulate over all those centuries.
15,000 years ago, glaciers receded that had covered British Columbia, and rivers developed that were really barren because all you had is granite and and no vegetation because it was under ice. The salmon brought nitrogen in their bodies into the rivers, and they make the rivers more fertile. And this nitrogen was picked up by the first bears and by birds and transported along these rivers and into the forest. Nowadays we can see that trees that are growing along the riverbeds contain nitrogen that comes from salmon. And these trees are called salmon trees. It's a beautifully evocative term. The rivers were further populated, probably on purpose, rivers that didn't have a salmon run, by the First Nation themselves. They could transport eggs from spawning bed to another spawning bed, and the salmon were managed very smartly. So this wealth of salmon is the reason why some villages of hunter-gatherers, the only one probably in the whole world, could maintain themselves for centuries and millennia. And these villages were structured around salmon. When settlers came upon first contact, they thought that the savage didn't know what they were doing. So they closed the fishery, the First Nation were not permitted to continue fishing, and many, many salmon runs were destroyed in the first years of settler development, and huge number of canneries were opened along the coast of British Columbia.
By acting as it does, human life is now a threat because it could cause life itself, in its most complex forms, to disappear from the planet. We seem to have problems controlling our activity. But if we don't, the sixth extinction could wipe us out. These realities were unthinkable less than 100 years ago. But today, this has become the biggest problem for humankind.
There are areas on Earth which no one owns, which in legal terms are called res nullius, things without masters. For example, the international waters in the ocean, the poles, the Arctic, the Antarctic, the migratory species that move across borders. These natural spaces cannot be owned by anyone, but they are exploitable by all, which leads to overfishing and the desire to drill for oil in the Arctic. If we really want to protect these large ecosystems that are vital for the planet, we must consider them common, but not common property, because if we consider them as property, we're still thinking in an anthropocentric way, which means that we still consider nature as an infinite resource, and especially a thing we can own and dominate. It's therefore necessary to recognize them as natural commons and to give them a legal status of their own, where humankind assumes the duty of protecting them, not just for the benefit of humans, but for every living thing, because they guarantee the good health of the whole. We have recently developed the technology to go down to the deepest depths to see the ecosystems of the ocean floors. Lightless ecosystems with extreme conditions and animals that have managed to adapt to them. There are chimneys from underwater volcanoes. It truly is the surface of another planet. At great depths, we can also find what we call polymetallic nodules. These are rare metals, which we use to make batteries for our cell phones or electric cars. We're currently in the process of issuing permits to industries that want to suck up these nodules. The desire of humans to make an industry work is much greater than their desire to support scientists in documenting the impacts that these mining activities could have. But we do know that these environments are incredibly stable. But once disturbed, it takes hundreds of years to regenerate them.
In
2004, I founded an organization called Bloom, with a mind-bogglingly naive belief that by publishing a book and having an exhibition on the abyss, we could reach out to people's hearts, and that by creating a link, an emotional attachment, a consciousness, a strong awareness of the beauty of the world, of the amazing diversity of species and beauty of the ocean, the planet, etc., it would lead to coherent actions. But while knowing and loving are vital to act, they're definitely not enough. Unfortunately, decision chains and power relations in the real world can be extremely violent.
Sadly, today we kill unfathomable numbers of individual fishes. The estimates are conservatively hundreds of billions per year. If you lined them up end to end, a fish of an ordinary size, they would reach the sun, not the moon, but the sun and back. And it's easy to forget that each one is an individual. Each one has emotions, has feelings, has an intelligence, has a life. To make things worse, the methods we use to catch fishes are not based on what's most humane or the nicest way. It's the method is how many we can catch with the least effort. So fishes get caught in big nets, and those nets are drawn in like purse strings in some cases, and so the fishes are crushed among sometimes more than 100,000 other fish. And then they're raised to the surface. If they're swimming deep down, their swim bladders expand, crushing neighboring organs and pushing their eyes out. Not a very nice way to go. And then if they're still alive when they get on the boat deck, they die of suffocation or possibly bleeding when somebody cuts their gills or what have you. So it's not very nice ways to die.
At
Bloom, we felt for a very long time that something is wrong with the fishing economy. And this came about by looking into the fishing companies' operating accounts and a list of all the public subsidies for the fishing industry.
alloués au secteur de la pêche. Et en fait, quand on croise en effet...
And once we'd examined both, we realized that basically the industry is unprofitable.
De pêche sont gros, c'est-à-dire des bateaux...
The bigger the fishing operations, the bigger the slow-engine boats that trawl the bottom of the sea. And these use a lot of diesel fuel. The impacts on the environment are dreadful, as they are on the operating accounts of the fishing companies, which struggle to get by. The most environmentally destructive fishing methods are those that depend on public subsidies and public money. In such a simple equation, all you have to do is turn off the stream of public money flowing like a fountain into the fishing industry to eliminate its most destructive methods.
Artisanal fisheries is what we should have in the future because industrial fisheries are a mess. Nature produces the fish, it's not fishers that produce the fish. And if nature tells you, I cannot produce as much fish that you need to make a living, then the message is clear. You should stop fishing that stock and go somewhere else. But if you have subsidies to continue fishing, you can continue to exploit an overexploited stock. So subsidies are one of the main reasons where we have fleets that are too big, exploiting stock that are too small. And basically, if we could withdraw subsidies from fisheries, industrial fisheries, we would have more fish, we would have more profit in fisheries, and we wouldn't need to subsidize them.
It's estimated that more than 400 million tons of plastic is being produced every year. 300 million tons of that is wasted, and about 11 million tons of that plastic is ending up in our ocean environments. This is incredibly alarming because plastic production is expected to double over the next decade. And without changes in our management, infrastructure development, and policies to mitigate this pollution, it's now estimated that about 90 million tons of plastic pollution will end up in our ocean by the year 2030. I think one of the greatest challenges we're facing is that our systems are not built with circularity in mind. Our culture is based on a take, make, waste model, and humans are the only species on this planet to produce what we call garbage. The implications of plastic pollution, at this point, the full scope is unknown. You will find plastics now in the rainwater. They are located as deep as the Mariana Trench, up to the tops of mountains. There is not a nook or cranny on this planet that you will find that is plastic-free.
The Arctic is the cooling system. It is the air conditioner for the planet. It is breaking down. And the connection there is that what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic. It impacts everywhere else. What we had said was going to get worse is happening today. The droughts, the fires, the floods, the hurricanes, the tornadoes, all of those things are linked to the breakdown of the Arctic ice and glaciers. It changes the current of the oceans. The oceans are the drivers of climate change. It changes everything, the salt content. And it has been playing itself out in these states of emergencies that we have lived for a long time, are now playing itself out in many other places in the world. If you protect the Arctic, you save the planet. That's the direct link with the Arctic and its ice.
With climate change today, water temperatures can rise above average, and notably above the maximum summer temperatures. If the water temperature rises 1 degree above that maximum temperature, we'll get what we call bleaching, where the corals expel their zooxanthella. That's why they look white, because they no longer have algae in their tissue. And since these algae provide energy for the corals, they find themselves starved to death in a way. That's how bleaching episodes translate into massive, large-scale mortality. The biggest threats to the coral reefs are global problems, the rise of CO2 worldwide and global warming. And to deal with this locally, we're powerless.
Faced with the consequences of the ecological and climate crisis, we must think of new rules for coexistence. These rules must be realigned with biological laws. We also have the right to ask this: how come that certain activities are carried out with full knowledge of the facts and are thus criminal in nature? They threaten human populations. They threaten a transgenerational right to a healthy environment, to have the right to live, feed ourselves, and be healed. So why is the destruction of the planet not recognized as a crime? That's why in national and international criminal laws, we must recognize the crime of ecocide. A crime against the system Earth that threatens living conditions for generations to come. Ecocide comes from the Greek oikos, meaning house, and side comes from Latin and means to kill, to destroy. So it means to destroy the common house.
I feel the pain of the world, and it's not easy. We're living through a lot of traumas. What we live, we make the earth live too.
You know, when we see an ocean filled with plastic or an old-growth, clear-cut forest, and we feel that deep pit of anxiety, of sadness, of fear, it can be incredibly overwhelming. And to not have the tools in our Western culture to be able to move through that overwhelm, it often gets stuck in our bodies as trauma. And so people are almost even afraid to communicate what they're experiencing. When I was introduced to a woman called Joanna Macy, she's an eco-philosopher from Berkeley, California, and she teaches about the work that reconnects. The tools that Joanna teaches are completely life-changing. What they allow us to do is come together and co-create a safe space together. And whatever comes up for you, whether it's tears or screaming, anger, I mean, all of these emotions are interconnected and feed each other. And then by experiencing that grief together, which is oddly very unique right now, we can then see the world through new eyes. We can experience that transformation so that we can then move towards the comprehensive solutions that are needed to guide our humanity towards survival and sustainability.
The challenges and the losses and the sadness and the darkness that comes is not a time to give up. It's about a time to stay with it, because it's the time in which your spirit needs to move in a higher consciousness level and not give up, and you become stronger. And so I've learned through this life journey that this is the evolution of spirit indeed.
My cousin and friend Shanice and I decided to make a video about protecting rivers. That video got me where I am today. It has allowed me to travel to the UN to discuss the challenges in our territory. It also helped to recognize the river as a living entity with rights.
In 2021, the Malagoli Regional Municipality on Quebec's North Shore, in association with the Iquanichit Innu Reservation, announced that the Magpie River, a wild river in the middle of the boreal forest, was now a legal entity. And they declared themselves the guardians of the river's rights, the right to flow freely, the right not to be polluted, the right to simply exist, the right to regenerate, the right to restoration and protection.
The Magpie River paved the way here in Quebec, Canada, for the St. Lawrence River to also have that recognition. But that's part of a global movement. Among the Maori people and in Colombia, people are starting to wake up and realize that we're here thanks to nature. Without nature, we wouldn't survive. It's this water that gives life to everything.
Eventually, I got to a point working with my love and passion for aquatic environments, and I knew that I wanted to do something on the water, and so I literally sat down on James's mom's couch and I just started writing out what it was that I really wanted to create in this world and on this planet in my lifetime. And so pages and pages, and then how do you give it a name? And what kind of entity should it be? And eventually what came out was Ocean Legacy. Ocean Legacy was founded in 2014. Our recycling branch really became inspired in 2016 with one unique year when a bunch of groups really pooled our resources together to have our first barge and helicopter operation, where we removed, 40 to 60 tons of material in one season. And it was upon this collection that it really struck us the scale of the issue on our own coastline, but as well as what was going to happen to all of this material once it was collected. So what we ended up doing was starting to develop our own sorting methods so that we could really start to repurpose and recycle as much of these materials as possible. And this really was the catalyst that inspired us to create an entire recycling facility and invent new processes to be able to recirculate these materials that are being collected. Our dream is to have this facility act as a resource hub for the entire Northwest Pacific and to create processing solutions not only for our own community, but to help catalyze and assist other communities.
We won our fight against bottom trawling because we stayed serious and persevered for years. But it's really thanks to the citizens who put a lot of pressure on the brand Intermarché, which owned the bottom trawling fleet. And so many citizens protested on Intermarché's social media that it tarnished their reputation. They had to create a sort of crisis cell to figure out how to respond to this tidal wave of citizens expressing their true concerns. Clearly, when citizens decide to unite and find a target to express their refusal of this or that, brands have to respond. So citizens can be extremely powerful. And thanks to mobilized citizens and nothing else, Intermarché felt so much pressure that they agreed to negotiate. We negotiated in private what concessions they were prepared to make with regard to the depth at which they trawled. We negotiated this depth in private in a meeting room, and it ended up in European legislation. Crazy, huh?
The revival of Polynesian culture began during the 1960s and 70s. And it was part of a general revival across the Pacific cultures. In this context, many traditions were revitalized. For example, respecting the rhythm of the seasons. And Rahui is one of those traditions updated through the community's initiatives. Literally, Rahui means prohibition. Often it's temporary, on either a resource or a territory. Rahui was a prohibition that human communities could impose.
When we talk about Rahui, there is a spiritual dimension. It speaks to the core of the Polynesian people. When we say Rahui, we know what it means, so we don't really need to talk about it. This Rahui was put in place in 2017. So we put in a request to the population. Most of the population was okay with it. Cryobe suggested we divide the area into 3 parts because they realized that in other Pacific Rahui there was only one zone, and once they lifted it, everything was open and it was harder to increase. The 3 zones are simple. The one in the middle stays closed. It's a tapu. On the side, we're opening for a limited time.
Before implementing the Rahui, there were about 60 to 70 kilos of commercial fish per 1,000 square meters. Since we implemented the Teahupu Rahui and the Tawitira Rahui, we've gone up to 400 or 450 kilos of commercial fish per 1,000 square meters. And now we can see the spillover effects. Fish thriving outside the Rahui, where we saw an increase of 150 kilograms of commercial fish per 1,000 square meters. So we were able to multiply by 6 the biomass of fish consumed. With small Polynesian Rahuis, we get an excellent forecast of what could happen if we protect larger surfaces.
In 2008, Ecuador recognized the rights of nature in its constitution. This has resulted in more than 50 lawsuits being filed since 2008, and in 2/3 of them, nature won. For example, one of the most extensive mangroves in the world, the Chiapas mangrove, won against establishing a shrimp farming installation. Justice sometimes even went really far. In the natural reserve of the Galapagos Islands, a Chinese fishing boat of more than 100 meters long was boarded and 6,220 sharks were found in the hold, including pregnant females. Their fins had been cut off to send to China to make soup. 6,200 sharks were killed for nothing. They didn't even eat the meat. The Ecuadorian judge ruled that it was a crime committed against sharks. The captain and the sailors were jailed, the boat was destroyed, and he gave a substantial fine to the ship owner. When bringing about a legal revolution like this, to recognise natural elements, ecosystems, rivers and forests as legal entities, it's a completely new legal framework because it becomes preventive law. In pure ecological prejudice, a disaster has already occurred and must be repaired or compensated. Natural rights allow us to act preventively, and considering the current climate and ecological crises, the law must be changed to protect the interests of ecosystems before the catastrophe occurs, before pollution begins.
The
biodiversity in the St. Lawrence is incredible. It's a very efficient machine, even faster than forest regeneration. While forests are growing, we have an ecosystem with phytoplankton blooms and whales that work like a machine, this instant, capturing the most CO2 possible. And since we have the biggest estuary in the world, this natural machine impacts the entire planet. The St. Lawrence hydrographic basin alone contains 25% of the world's available freshwater. Hence the importance of recognising this vital ecosystem for the entire planet, for all humanity as a legal entity. A new initiative was just launched. On May 5, 2022, two bills were jointly introduced to the House of Commons of Canada and the National Assembly of Quebec to give legal status to the St. Lawrence hydrographic basin and to defend its right to exist and not be polluted in a court of law. So today, we need to have the entire hydrographic basin recognised as a legal entity so that we can protect it for future generations.
I believe the entire world now recognizes the importance of the environment. More politicians talk about climate change and biodiversity, something they never did before. People in cities don't always see the importance of the ocean. It's important to know that everything is connected, through rivers flowing in cities, for example. One way or another, all rivers reach the ocean.
Actually, it doesn't make any difference what we do or don't do as individuals. What matters is what we do as part of a movement, as part of an NGO. And then in that case, we can, instead of bothering our friends about what they should eat and our friends and our parents, we'll bother the one that are responsible and the one that make decisions and can make decisions that are important. The impact begins when your efforts are magnified through acting with other people.
Our ideal, our goal must be to ensure that the Earth doesn't become uninhabitable. Humankind now recognizes the danger we're in. Astronomy is the past, the question of how we got here. Ecology is about how to stay in good health, how not to destroy ourselves through what we call the sixth extinction. We know what threatens us, and we know what to do. What matters is wanting to do it.